Hey guys! Tonight we're not just exploring history, we're diving fork first into the most intimate and often least glamorous details of daily life in the ancient world. Forget the grand colosseums, the mighty legions, and the soaring aqueducts for a moment. Tonight, we're venturing into the Roman kitchen, and perhaps, more accurately, the Roman dumpster. Get ready to grimace, because we're talking about the miserable food you would have eaten in ancient Rome and more. Boring history for sleep. You're about to discover that dining in the Eternal City was often far from a gourmet experience. Especially if you weren't one of the elite. You probably think of Roman food as lavish feasts with exotic ingredients. Oh, how delightfully wrong you might be. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're out there somewhere in the quiet hum of your own corner of the world, let us know where you're listening from. Perhaps you're nestled in a cozy apartment in New York City, or maybe drifting off in a peaceful cottage in rural England. Wherever you are, just relax. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in the bustling marketplace of ancient Rome, the Forum Boarium, perhaps, or even a smaller local Macellum. The air, even in your imagination, is thick with a cacophony of sounds and, more importantly for our purposes tonight, a truly bewildering array of smells. Your nose wrinkles, almost instinctively, at a particular, pungent aroma that seems to cling to everything. It's salty, fishy, fermented, and utterly ubiquitous. You are experiencing the omnipresent scent of garum, the Romans' beloved, vile fish sauce. Imagine, if you dare, the process. You take vast quantities of small, whole fish, anchovies, mackerel, sprats, or sometimes just the entrails of larger fish. You layer them in enormous vats, often exposed to the blazing Mediterranean sun. Then, you add a generous amount of salt, sometimes herbs, and you let it ferment, for weeks, sometimes months. This putrid mixture sits, slowly decomposing under the heat, turning into a thick, yellowish-brown liquid. This is garum. It's basically fermented fish guts, reduced to a concentrated, incredibly strong, savory liquid. It's the ancient Roman equivalent of ketchup, soy sauce, or Worcestershire sauce, but with a funk level dialed up to 11. You see it everywhere. Every street vendor has it. Every Roman kitchen, from the humblest dwelling to the most opulent villa, has a jar of it. You use it on everything. Your breakfast drizzled with garum, your dinner cooked with garum. You even dilute it with water to make a refreshing drink called hydrogarum, which, honestly, sounds like a dare. You're probably thinking, how could they stand it? Well, their palates were different, to say the least. It provided a powerful umami punch in a diet that often lacked strong flavors beyond herbs and salt. Historians still debate the exact flavor profile of ancient garum, as recipes and fermentation methods varied widely by region and type of fish. Some suggest that the highest quality garum sociorum from Cartagena was prized like the finest wines, while cheaper versions were truly repulsive. But let's not sugarcoat it. The sheer smell of a garum factory, especially downwind, must have been nauseating. Imagine the flies, the heat, the stench of rotting fish intensified by fermentation. It was a miserable, unsanitary industry, often relegated to the outskirts of cities. And while it was a vital source of protein and seasoning, it also carried health risks. Unclean production methods could lead to bacterial contamination, making garum a potential source of stomach upset, and worse. You're pouring this stuff onto your food, confident it's enhancing the taste, completely unaware of the invisible microscopic horrors it might contain. A little-known detail about garum is its social stratification. There wasn't just one type. There were cheap, gritty versions made from whole fish, and incredibly expensive. Clear, almost amber-colored varieties made from specific fish entrails, sometimes aged for years like a fine wine. The elite might have savored a delicate garum floss flower of garum, while you, the common person, were likely stuck with the cheaper, stronger, and undoubtedly more pungent stuff. This was their condiment, their flavor enhancer, their everything. You couldn't escape it. It permeated Roman cuisine in a way that modern palates would find both fascinating and utterly revolting. So, as you drift further into the history of Roman cuisine, let the pungent, almost overwhelming aroma of garum waft through your mind. It's the baseline flavor of ancient Rome, a constant, unavoidable presence that defines much of what you would have eaten. And while it might have been delicious to a Roman, to your modern sensibilities, it's probably one of the most miserable, yet utterly fascinating, culinary experiences you could imagine. You can almost feel the salt on your tongue and the lingering, powerful taste of fermented fish. You're still there? Lingering in the quiet, pungent haze left by the memory of garum, the Romans' all-encompassing fish sauce. Your imaginary palate might still be reeling. But now, let's move on to the very foundation of the Roman diet. The staple that underpinned every meal, every social class, and often, every moment of your misery. Bread's stale reality. You chew on gritty, often moldy, daily sustenance. Imagine your typical Roman morning. You wake up in your small, often crowded insula apartment, or perhaps in your more modest rural home. Your first thought, if you're like most Romans, is likely about bread. It was the most important foodstuff, the caloric bedrock of Roman life. You might think of freshly baked, crusty loaves straight from the oven. Oh, how sweetly naive that thought is. For the vast majority of Romans, bread was a far grittier, tougher, and often less appealing affair. First, let's talk about the grain itself. For many, especially the poor, your bread would be made from coarse, unprocessed barley, or a mix of inferior wheat. This isn't the finely milled flour you're used to. It's often whole grain, which sounds healthy by modern standards. But in ancient Rome, it meant it was full of bits of husk, chaff, and frankly, whatever else got into the grain during harvesting, transport, or storage. You might feel tiny, abrasive particles scratching the roof of your mouth with every bite. Historians still debate the extent of dental wear caused by the Roman diet, but archaeological evidence of Roman teeth clearly shows significant abrasion, likely due to stone grit from milling. This means your teeth would be slowly, agonizingly ground down over your lifetime. And how was it milled not in a clean, sterile factory? You're talking about heavy, cumbersome stone mills, often powered by slaves or animals. Inevitably, tiny fragments of the millstones would break off and get mixed into the flour. So, with every single bite of bread, you were consuming minute particles of rock. This wasn't just unpleasant. It was a constant source of dental problems, leading to cracked teeth, infections, and agonizing toothaches. Imagine the constant dull ache in your jaw, made worse by every meal. A little-known detail is that Roman bread, especially for the common classes, was often very dark and dense due to the coarse flour and limited leavening agents. It was nothing like the fluffy white bread we often associate with modern baking. Then there's the baking process. If you were lucky, you might have access to a communal oven in your neighborhood, or perhaps a small, rudimentary one in a wealthy household. But hygiene standards were, shall we say, flexible. The dough might be kneaded in less than spotless conditions, attracting flies and other unwelcome guests. And the storage of the finished product? Even worse, your bread wasn't going into airtight containers or refrigerators. It would sit exposed, quickly going stale, hard, and often developing mold. You'd pick off the green fuzzy bits, trying to salvage what you could, because waste was simply not an option. Imagine gnawing on a piece of rock-hard, stale bread for breakfast. You'd likely soften it by dipping it in water. Or, of course, a generous splash of garum. This made it marginally more palatable. But it didn't remove the grit or the underlying unpleasantness. This was your fuel for a day of hard labor, or bustling through the crowded streets of Rome. You weren't eating for pleasure, you were eating for survival. Even if you were a bit wealthier, your bread might not be much better. While the elite could afford finer, whiter flour often bleached with chalk, which brought its own delightful health issues, their bread would still go stale quickly in the absence of modern preservation. You might have seen elegant loaves at a patrician's table, but chances are they were tough by day two. Historians still debate the precise techniques and ingredients used for different grades of Roman bread, as specific recipes are rare. However, the general consensus is that even the best Roman bread likely wouldn't meet modern standards of freshness or texture. And what about those infamous Roman bakeries you might have passed by one? The smell of wood smoke and yeast perhaps momentarily enticing. But step inside, and you'd see the grime, the insects, and the sweat of the bakers mixing dough with their bare hands, often in large open vats. This was not a sterile environment. Any illnesses or contaminants present would easily find their way into your daily bread. It's a slightly less glamorous image than the romanticized vision of Roman life. So, as you drift further into sleep, let the gritty, slightly acrid taste of ancient Roman bread settle on your imaginary tongue. It was the staff of life. Yes, but often a miserable one, a source of sustenance, but also of dental pain and constant, dull dissatisfaction. You realize that even the most fundamental food item in their diet was fraught with challenges, a daily reminder of the harsh realities of ancient existence. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That your most basic meal could be a constant, microscopic battle. You're still there, lingering in that slightly gritty, stale aftertaste of Roman bread, wondering how you'd ever manage a proper meal without a modern dentist. Now, let's transition from the solid foundation of their diet to something perhaps even more ubiquitous, and often just as uninspiring: porridge, a bland staple. You endure endless, uninspired bowls of grain. Imagine your typical day as a common Roman. For breakfast, you might have your piece of stale bread, perhaps dipped in water or garum. But for countless meals throughout the day, especially if you were poor, a soldier, or even a child, your primary source of calories would be pulse. This wasn't some fancy to creamy dish. It was essentially porridge, a thick gruel made from boiled grains. The most common grain for pulse was emmer wheat or barley, often coarsely ground. You'd take these grains, boil them with water, perhaps a bit of salt, and simmer them until they formed a thick, sticky mush. That's it? No sugar? No fruit? No milk unless you were a shepherd? Maybe. It was the ultimate minimalist meal, designed for sustenance, not for pleasure. You'd eat it hot in the cold mornings, or cold and congealed at midday. It was relentlessly bland, a canvas awaiting a splash of something, anything, to give it character. And that something, more often than not, was garum. Remember that potent fish sauce from earlier? It wasn't just for dipping bread. It was the primary flavor enhancer for pulse. Imagine stirring in a spoonful of fermented fish guts into your already bland grain porridge. You might also add herbs, or a bit of olive oil if you could afford it. But for many, it was just the gruel, plain and simple, or with a dash of that infamous pungent sauce. You're probably thinking, doesn't that make it worse? And for your modern palate, it certainly would. But for the Roman, it added a vital saltiness and umami that elevated it from utterly tasteless to merely tolerable. The texture itself could be challenging. Depending on the coarseness of the grain and the cooking time, pulse could range from a thick, gluey paste to something almost solid, needing to be cut with a knife rather than spooned. You'd chew and chew, feeling the familiar grit of the stone-ground flour. It was filling, undoubtedly, but hardly inspiring. This relentless monotony, meal after meal, day after day, year after year, would test the patience of even the most stoic Roman. Historians still debate the variety of side dishes or condiments that were regularly eaten with pulse by the common Roman, as specific records are scarce. But it's clear it formed the unglamorous core of their diet. Some suggest dried fruits or a bit of cheese might have been added by those who could afford it. But for most, it was just the basic gruel. Beyond its blandness, pulse could also be a source of discomfort or illness. If the grain was old or improperly stored, it could be contaminated with mold or pests. The water used for boiling might not always be clean, and the cooking vessels themselves, if not properly cleaned, could harbor bacteria. While a well-cooked pulse was likely safe, the everyday realities of ancient hygiene meant that every bowl carried a subtle risk of an upset stomach. Or worse, you're spooning this into your mouth, relying on it for energy, but also, unknowingly, inviting potential digestive distress. It's a bit like playing Russian roulette with your breakfast, hoping today isn't the day the stomach gods decide to strike. Even for the wealthier Romans, pulse held a place, though often transformed. They might enjoy more refined versions, made with finer flour, perhaps enriched with eggs, cheese, or honey, transforming it into something closer to a savory polenta or a sweet dessert. But these were the exceptions, the fancy iterations that bore little resemblance to the dreary, everyday gruel consumed by the masses. The humble pulse truly defined the culinary divide between the haves and have-nots. A little-known detail about pulse is its historical significance. It was considered the staple food of the early Roman Republic and its hardy, virtuous citizens. Even as the empire grew wealthy and its cuisine became more elaborate for the elite, pulse remained a symbol of the old Roman virtues of simplicity and hardiness. You might hear older Romans grumble about the decadent diets of the rich, longing for the simpler, tougher days when pulse was king. This nostalgia, however, likely ignored the actual misery of its relentless consumption. So, as you drift further into sleep, let the bland, heavy sensation of ancient Roman porridge settle in your imaginary stomach. It was the fuel that built an empire, the sustenance that fed legions and citizens. But it was also a daily testament to the grinding monotony and often unappetizing realities of ancient Roman life. You realize that even the most basic comfort of food could be a constant, uninspired chore, a fundamental part of the misery of ancient existence. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That the very food meant to sustain you was often just boring. You're still there, lingering in that slightly dull, starchy aftertaste of Roman porridge, perhaps feeling a pang of sympathy for the ancient Romans' relentless pursuit of blandness. We've covered the pungent allure of garum and the gritty reality of their daily bread and gruel. Now, let's venture into another cornerstone of their diet, one that held both essential nutrition and a fair share of culinary disappointment: vegetables' rough justice. You gnaw on tough, often bitter, garden fare. Imagine yourself strolling through a Roman market, past the bustling fish stalls and the bakers. You approach the vegetable vendors, hoping for a vibrant array of fresh produce. You might see bundles of greens, root vegetables, and legumes, but don't expect the crisp, sweet, perfectly cultivated specimens you're accustomed to today. Roman vegetables were, for the most part, a tougher, often wilder, and frequently more bitter affair. For the common Roman, vegetables formed a crucial part of their diet, often filling the gaps left by expensive meat. You'd be eating a lot of cabbage, turnips, onions, leeks, and various types of greens. These weren't necessarily the tender varieties you find in modern supermarkets. They were hardy, often fibrous, and required significant cooking to become palatable. Imagine boiling cabbage for hours to make it tender enough to chew, its strong, sulfurous smell filling your cramped living space. The concept of selective breeding for sweetness and tenderness, so prevalent in modern agriculture, was primitive at best. So, the carrots you encountered would likely be purple or white, and far tougher and earthier than their orange, sweet modern counterparts. The leafy greens, like mallow or nettles, might be more bitter and fibrous than spinach or lettuce. You'd be chewing and chewing and chewing, extracting every last bit of nutrient from these resilient plants. It's a bit like trying to enjoy a meal where every component seems to be actively resisting your efforts to consume it. Then there's the preparation. You're not typically sautéing them lightly or eating them raw in crisp salads. Vegetables were often boiled for long periods, perhaps stewed with herbs and garum. Yes, garum again, or mashed into a pulp. This extensive cooking, while making them softer, often leached out many of the more delicate flavors and nutrients. You're eating for sustenance, not for sophisticated culinary enjoyment. The texture would often be mushy, the flavors muted, dominated by salt and the ever-present fish sauce. Historians still debate the extent of Roman culinary sophistication for the common classes, often focusing on elite banquets, while the rich had access to exotic spices and complex preparations. The daily vegetable intake for most Romans was likely quite simple and utilitarian. Consider the hygiene. Vegetables would be grown in fields that might be fertilized with human or animal waste, then brought to market unwashed. You'd buy them, carry them home, and likely wash them in water that wasn't always perfectly clean. This constant exposure to bacteria and parasites through unwashed or improperly prepared produce would have been a significant source of gastrointestinal illness. You might find yourself grappling with an upset stomach or worse, simply from trying to eat your greens. A little-known detail is that Roman farmers often used a form of night soil human waste as fertilizer, a common practice in ancient agriculture, which, while efficient for growing crops, posed significant health risks if proper hygiene wasn't observed. For the elite, of course, the vegetable experience could be elevated. They might have access to a wider variety, grown in private gardens, and prepared by skilled cooks with exotic spices imported from the East. They might enjoy asparagus, though smaller and wilder than today's, artichokes, or even exotic fruits like figs and dates. But these were rare indulgences, a stark contrast to the daily, tough, and often bitter fare of the average Roman. You, as a commoner, would rarely, if ever, taste such refined produce. So, as you drift further into sleep, imagine the robust, earthy taste of ancient Roman vegetables. They were a vital part of the diet, providing essential fiber and vitamins. But they were also a testament to the less glamorous, more challenging aspects of ancient gastronomy. You chew on tough leaves and starchy roots, feeling the grit and the occasional bitterness. A reminder that even the healthiest components of their diet came with their own set of miseries. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That even simple greens could be such a persistent chore. You're still there, lingering in that slightly fibrous, earthy memory of Roman vegetables, perhaps feeling a newfound appreciation for modern supermarket produce. We've covered the fundamental staples, the garum, the bread, the porridge, and the greens. Now, let's talk about a category of food that, for most Romans, remained largely a dream, a coveted luxury, or a rare indulgence. Meat a rare luxury. You crave protein, but settle for scraps or nothing. Imagine yourself as an ordinary Roman citizen, perhaps a humble laborer or a shopkeeper in the bustling city. The smell of roasting meat might occasionally waft from a wealthy villa or a special feast, a tantalizing aroma that makes your stomach rumble. But for your own daily diet, meat, in any substantial quantity, was largely out of reach. Your primary protein sources would be legumes like lentils and chickpeas, cheese if you could afford it, eggs on rare occasions, and of course, that ever-present garum. Meat was expensive. Breeding and raising livestock required land, fodder, and labor, resources that were often dedicated to more calorie-efficient grains. For the vast majority of the population, a typical meal would be almost entirely vegetarian, centered around grains and vegetables. If you were lucky, you might get a bit of bacon or some cured pork, but beef or lamb were primarily reserved for special occasions, religious sacrifices, or the tables of the wealthy elite. You might occasionally get a chance to buy leftover scraps from a butcher, or a piece of a less desirable cut. Think about the quality of the meat available to the common person. It wasn't the prime cuts you see today. You might be eating the tougher, fattier parts, or older animals. The meat would often be cured with salt to preserve it, making it incredibly salty and requiring extensive soaking before cooking. Imagine trying to chew through a piece of tough, leathery, oversalted pork, perhaps boiled into a stew with your ubiquitous vegetables and, inevitably, a healthy dose of garum. It's certainly filling, but hardly a culinary delight. Pork was the most common meat consumed when it was available, followed by goat and sheep. Beef was less common due to the effort required to raise cattle and their value for plowing. Poultry, like chickens, geese, and ducks, were eaten, but again, often more accessible to those with their own small farms or a bit more disposable income. You might dream of a juicy roast, but your reality is often a bowl of lentil stew. Historians still debate the average frequency of meat consumption among different social classes in ancient Rome. But it's clear that while the elite consumed it regularly, the lower classes likely ate it only a few times a month, if at all, often relying on public distributions or religious festivals. A horrifying aspect, for those of more delicate sensibilities, was the consumption of less conventional protein sources. If you were truly poor, or during times of scarcity, you might resort to eating wild birds, small game like mice or dormice which, incidentally, were a delicacy for some wealthy Romans, often fattened up in special terracotta jars, or even insects. While not common for everyone, these were possibilities in the grim struggle for sustenance. Imagine the desperation that would drive you to consider such options. It's a reminder that hunger often overrides conventional palates. Even when meat was consumed, the methods of preparation could be quite different from today. Refrigeration didn't exist, so meat had to be eaten quickly, cured, or heavily spiced to mask any signs of spoilage. You might be eating meat that was just on the verge of turning, its flavor masked by a heavy hand of pepper or other expensive spices. This, of course, carried significant risks of foodborne illness. You're trying to get vital protein, but you're also playing a subtle game of chance with your stomach. A little-known detail is that Roman butchers often performed their work in open-air markets, without modern sanitation, making the meat highly susceptible to contamination from flies, dust, and other environmental factors. For the wealthy, of course, meat was a different story. Their banquets were famous for their extravagance, featuring roasted wild boar, stuffed dormice, flamingo tongues, and peacocks. This was a world away from your reality, a stark contrast that highlighted the immense social divide. You might hear tales of these lavish feasts, perhaps with a mix of envy and disgust at the sheer decadence, knowing that such abundance was unattainable for you. So, as you drift further into sleep, consider the hollow ache of craving for meat in ancient Rome. For most, it remained a distant luxury, a tantalizing aroma that rarely translated into a substantial meal. You feel the constant search for protein, the often unsatisfying reality of a mostly vegetarian diet, and the occasional, risky indulgence in something more. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That even basic sustenance could be such a struggle, and luxury so starkly out of reach. You're still there, lingering in that slightly unsatisfied craving for ancient Roman meat, perhaps dreaming of a perfectly grilled steak that never quite materialized. We've explored the humble staples and rare luxuries of their solid food. Now, let's pour ourselves a drink and delve into a beverage that was central to Roman life, yet often came with its own set of deeply unpleasant and even horrifying risks, wine-sweetened and suspect. You sip a drink, unknowingly tainted with peril. Imagine yourself at a Roman tavern, a capona, perhaps unwinding after a long day. You're presented with a goblet of wine, a dark, rich liquid that holds a sacred place in Roman culture. It's more than just an alcoholic beverage. It's a staple, often consumed throughout the day, even by children, though usually heavily diluted. You might think of crisp, clear wines like those from modern vineyards. Oh, How delightfully wrong you'd be. Roman wine was often a far more brutal, and sometimes literally toxic, affair. First, let's talk about the taste. Roman wine was incredibly diverse, ranging from rough, unfermented grape juice to highly concentrated, aged vintages. But a common characteristic for many was its incredible sweetness. The Romans often boiled their grape must juice in large lead pots to create a thick, sweet syrup called sapa, or defrutum. Remember our earlier discussion about lead poisoning in Rome? Yes, this is where it comes back with a vengeance. This lead-sweetened syrup was then added to the wine to enhance its sweetness, prevent souring, and even to add color. You're sipping this supposedly delicious concoction, completely unaware that each swallow is delivering a minute, insidious dose of neurotoxin. Chronic lead poisoning, or plumism, could lead to a delightful array of symptoms: headaches, fatigue, irritability, memory loss, stomach cramps often misdiagnosed as simple digestive issues, and even paralysis or mental deterioration over time. For the wealthy elite, who consumed the most wine, and often from lead-lined goblets or pitchers, the exposure was significantly higher. You might see a distinguished senator become increasingly erratic, his judgment clouded, his temper flaring, and you'd attribute it to old age or the stresses of office, never realizing it might be the very wine he savors daily. Historians still debate the precise role lead poisoning from wine played in the broader decline of Roman society, but the chemical evidence of lead residues in Roman bones and artifacts is undeniable, indicating widespread exposure, particularly among the upper classes. Some scholars argue it contributed to lower birth rates and cognitive decline among the elite, weakening leadership. Beyond lead, the quality control for Roman wine was, let's say, inconsistent. You're not talking about modern bottling and sterile production. Wine was stored in large clay amphorae, often sealed with resin, and was susceptible to oxidation, spoilage, and bacterial contamination. You might be served a cup of wine that is sour, vinegary, or even slightly putrid, to mask these unpleasant flavors. Romans would often add a bewildering array of ingredients: herbs, spices, seawater, yes, really, resin, and even chalk or marble dust. Imagine drinking a gritty, sour wine that tastes vaguely of salt and pine, just trying to get your buzz on. A little-known detail is that Roman wine was rarely drunk neat. It was almost always diluted with water, sometimes hot, sometimes cold, and occasionally even mixed with snow. This dilution, while potentially reducing the immediate alcoholic impact, didn't remove the lead or other contaminants. The storage conditions were also far from ideal. Wine was often kept in hot, unventilated rooms, or transported over long distances in amphorae that could leak or spoil. You might receive a shipment of wine that has turned to vinegar, or worse, has become undrinkable sludge. This constant risk of spoilage meant that much effort was put into preservation, sometimes using methods that, ironically, introduced new risks. For the common person, wine might be watered down so heavily as to be barely alcoholic, more of a flavored water than a true wine. You might drink it simply because water sources were often unreliable or contaminated, and the fermentation process in wine made it safer, even if lead-laced. It was a choice between potential disease from dirty water or slow poisoning from your preferred beverage. A truly delightful ancient dilemma. And what about the hangovers? Oh, the hangovers from ancient Roman wine, laden with lead and questionable additives, must have been legendary. Imagine waking up with a throbbing headache, a queasy stomach, and a general feeling of malaise, compounded by the constant background effects of chronic lead exposure. You'd think it was simply the gods punishing you for your indulgence, not the result of ingesting heavy metals with your nightly tipple. So, as you drift further into sleep, let the cloying sweetness and the metallic tang of ancient Roman wine settle on your imaginary tongue. It was a beverage central to their lives, a symbol of their culture, but also an unwitting vector for hidden poisons and unpleasant flavors. You feel the constant, subtle assault on your body, the silent, insidious damage lurking in every sip. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That your most celebrated drink could also be your slowest undoing? You're still there, lingering in that slightly unsettling, possibly metallic aftertaste of ancient Roman wine, wondering if your imaginary liver is holding up. We've explored the staples, the luxuries, and the daily drinks of their diet. Now, let's widen our gaze beyond the individual dish and consider the entire dining experience, especially for the common Roman, and uncover the myriad of ways a simple meal could become fraught with unseen dangers, dining's hidden hazards. You navigate meals fraught with unseen dangers. Imagine yourself a typical Roman, sitting down for a meal. This isn't a pristine, sanitized environment. Whether you're in a crowded Copona tavern, a bustling Thermopolium fast food stall, or your own modest home, every aspect of food preparation and consumption carried inherent risks that modern sensibilities would find horrifying. You're not just eating food, you're playing a constant game of microbial roulette. First, let's talk about the water. You need water for cooking, for diluting wine, and sometimes for drinking directly. But the Roman water supply, while magnificent in its engineering with aqueducts bringing fresh water to cities, was far from perfectly safe at the point of consumption for everyone. If you lived in an insula apartment, your water might come from a communal tap, a cistern, or even a well, which could easily be contaminated by runoff from streets, sewage, or simply stagnant conditions. Imagine the bacteria, the parasites, the invisible threats lurking in your most basic beverage. You drink it, trusting that the long journey through aqueducts has somehow purified it, but unaware of the localized contamination. Historians still debate the precise incidence of waterborne diseases in ancient Rome, but archaeological evidence of parasites and the commonness of dysentery suggest it was a pervasive problem, especially in densely populated areas. Then there are the utensils and dishes. You're not using disposable plates or hygienically cleaned cutlery. Meals are eaten with hands or with simple spoons. Dishes are often made of pottery, which can be porous and difficult to clean thoroughly. Harboring bacteria. Imagine a communal eating space where dishes are simply rinsed, not scrubbed clean with hot, soapy water. Contaminants from one meal or one sick person could easily transfer to the next. You grasp your bread, dip it into a communal bowl, and unknowingly share not just food, but invisible microbial passengers with everyone else. It's a delightful thought, isn't it? Every meal a potential vector for unseen horrors. Food storage was another major hazard. Remember, no refrigeration. Perishable foods like meat, fish, and dairy would spoil rapidly, especially in the warm Mediterranean climate. While Romans used salt curing, smoking, and drying to preserve food, these methods weren't always perfect, and accidental contamination or insufficient preservation could lead to dangerously spoiled food. You might be served a piece of fish that looks fine, but is just on the verge of turning, its subtle signs of decay masked by liberal use of pungent garum or strong herbs. Eating spoiled food could lead to severe gastrointestinal distress, vomiting, diarrhea, and in severe cases, even death. You're trying to nourish yourself, but every bite carries a hidden risk. A little-known detail is that Roman chefs, especially those serving the wealthy, were skilled at disguising spoiled ingredients with heavy spices and sauces, turning potentially toxic food into something palatable through culinary art. In public eating establishments like Thermopolia fast food counters, the risks were even higher. You're buying food that might have been prepared hours ago, sitting exposed to flies, dust, and the elements. The vendors, working quickly in often unsanitary conditions, might not wash their hands or their cooking surfaces. Imagine grabbing a quick, hot meal from a street vendor, a stew, a sausage, and hoping for the best. The convenience came with a significant roll of the dice for your digestive health. It's a bit like playing food roulette every time you eat out. Pest infestation was also a constant reality. Insects, rodents, and other vermin were ubiquitous in ancient living spaces and food storage areas. You'd find them in your grain, in your pantry, possibly even in your cooked food. While generally not immediately fatal, their presence contributed to an unhygienic environment and could spread diseases. You might pick a beetle out of your porridge, thinking nothing of it, simply accepting it as a part of life. Finally, consider the cumulative effect. Day after day, meal after meal, you are exposed to these hidden hazards. Your body, without modern antibiotics or a deep understanding of hygiene, is constantly fighting off infections. Chronic digestive issues, recurring fevers, and general malaise would have been a common part of life for many Romans, subtly eroding their health and vitality. You're not just eating for sustenance, you're constantly defending yourself from the invisible horrors lurking in your dinner. So, as you drift further into sleep, let the subtle, unsettling thought of dining's hidden hazards in ancient Rome settle upon you. Every meal, from the most humble porridge to a seemingly fresh piece of bread, carried a risk of unseen contamination, spoiled ingredients, or unsafe practices. You feel the ghost of those lurking dangers, making even the most basic act of sustenance a gamble. It's a truly horrifying thought, isn't it? That your dinner could literally be trying to kill you? You're still there, lingering in that slightly queasy feeling from contemplating ancient Roman dining hazards. Perhaps imagining microscopic battles being waged inside your imaginary stomach. We've covered the everyday risks of common meals. Now, let's ascend the social ladder, peer into the grand villas, and discover that even at the pinnacle of Roman society, where abundance reigned, food could be horrifyingly, exquisitely awful, riddled with excess and truly bizarre concoctions. Feasts of foul excess. You witness opulence, often with truly disgusting dishes. Imagine yourself as an invited guest at a Roman cena, a lavish dinner party hosted by a wealthy patrician or even an emperor. You expect splendor, exotic entertainment, and a dazzling display of culinary mastery. And indeed, the table groans under the weight of countless dishes. But don't mistake opulence for good taste, or abundance for palatability. For every genuinely appealing dish, there would be several that would turn your modern stomach, designed more for shock value and ostentation than actual deliciousness. First, let's talk about the sheer quantity. These feasts were exercises in excess. You wouldn't just have 3 courses. You'd have dozens, sometimes served over many hours, even stretching into the next day. Imagine course after course arriving, your stomach already full. Yet the expectation is that you will at least sample everything. This isn't just uncomfortable, it's a form of edible torment, a constant, overwhelming parade of food. The concept of less is more was utterly alien to these Roman elites. You are meant to be impressed by the sheer volume and variety, even if much of it is unappetizing. Then there are the truly bizarre ingredients and preparations. Remember those dormice? Yes, they were often a delicacy, especially fattened in terracotta jars and served roasted or stuffed. You might find yourself staring at a platter of these tiny, furry rodents, perhaps wondering if you truly want to partake. Or how about flamingo tongues? Or peacock brains? These were not commonplace, but they illustrate the lengths to which the wealthy would go to demonstrate their exotic tastes and immense wealth. It's a culinary flex, designed to shock and awe, rather than to genuinely delight the palate. A little-known detail is that Roman cookbooks like Apicius's De Re Culinaria contain recipes for dishes like stuffed sow's udder and boiled ostrich, truly pushing the boundaries of what most modern diners would consider appetizing. And the sauces, beyond the omnipresent garum, yes, it would still feature prominently, even in refined versions. Roman elite cuisine often relied on incredibly complex, heavily spiced, and often overly sweet or overly sour sauces. They used copious amounts of pepper, cumin, coriander, saffron, and dates to create flavor profiles that could be overpowering and cloying. Imagine a dish of roasted pheasant, but instead of a simple juice, it's drenched in a sauce made from dates, honey, garum, and a dozen different spices, creating a confusing explosion of flavors that might completely mask the taste of the meat itself. It's a culinary assault, designed to impress with complexity, not necessarily balance. Historians still debate the true palatability of some of the more extreme Roman elite recipes, suggesting that many were more about status and display than genuine gastronomic pleasure, perhaps even serving as a form of conspicuous consumption that was deliberately difficult to enjoy. The presentation itself could be both magnificent and unsettling. You might see a roasted wild boar served whole, perhaps with an apple in its mouth, or a Trojan pig. A roasted pig stuffed with sausages, dates, and small birds, designed to burst open when cut. While impressive, these displays could also be somewhat grotesque, a reminder of the animal's former life, or simply an unnerving spectacle during a meal. The line between impressive culinary art and disturbing theatricality was often very thin. And then, there are the practical aspects of feasting for hours. Romans reclined on couches while eating, requiring them to constantly prop themselves up. With no modern cutlery, knives were used for carving, but forks were centuries away. Most food was eaten with hands or spoons. Imagine eating greasy, saucy dishes while reclining, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. This inevitably led to messy situations, and, undoubtedly, some very greasy fingers. And the inevitable need for a break. Wealthy Romans sometimes employed servants to tickle their throats with a feather, allowing them to vomit and continue eating. While this practice, known as vomitoria, might be exaggerated in popular culture, the very notion that it was even considered highlights the extreme excess and discomfort of these prolonged feasts. So, as you drift further into sleep, imagine the sensory overload of a Roman feast: the cloying sweetness, the overwhelming spices, the pungent garum, the sheer volume of bizarre and over-prepared dishes. You realize that even extreme wealth couldn't always buy culinary delight, and often, it bought only elaborate discomfort and a display of truly questionable taste. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That even the most luxurious meals could be so utterly miserable. You're still there, lingering in the opulent but unsettling sensory memory of Roman banquets, perhaps feeling a ghostly indigestion from all that ancient excess. We've explored the elite's sometimes grotesque culinary indulgences. Now, let's descend from the marble halls and venture into the chaotic, vibrant, but often deeply unsanitary world of common Roman eateries, street food's grimy delights. You grab a quick bite, risking instant regret. Imagine yourself a bustling city dweller in ancient Rome, perhaps a laborer or a student, without the luxury of a private kitchen or the time for a sit-down meal. You're hungry, and the city's myriad of street vendors beckons. These Thermopolia hot food stands and Papine taverns were the fast food joints of their day, offering quick, cheap sustenance to the masses. You might think of exciting, flavorful street food, but the reality was often far grimmer, filled with hidden risks and questionable hygiene. You approach a thermopolium, a counter with built-in clay pots dolia that kept food warm. The aroma might be enticing, perhaps a stew simmering, or sausages sizzling. But look closer. The food has often been sitting there for hours, exposed to the elements, dust blowing in from the unpaved streets, flies buzzing lazily around, and the general grime of a densely populated ancient city. Imagine buying a scoop of stew that has been slowly congealing and cooling, a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. You eat it quickly, perhaps standing, perhaps walking, hoping your stomach can handle whatever invisible horrors you're ingesting. The ingredients themselves could be suspect. Vendors, trying to maximize profit, might use lower quality cuts of meat, if any meat at all. Stale bread, or vegetables that are past their prime. You might be getting food that's just on the verge of spoiling. Its off flavors masked by liberal use of pungent garum, Yes, it returns or strong herbs. A little-known detail from archaeological digs in Pompeii is the discovery of thermopolia counters with remnants of ingredients, including lentils, fish, and even traces of animal blood, suggesting a wide variety of, often unappetizing, offerings. Water quality was a constant concern. Vendors would use water for cooking and washing dishes, often sourced from communal taps or fountains that might not be perfectly clean. The pots and utensils, usually made of earthenware, were porous and difficult to sterilize. Imagine dishes simply rinsed in cold, murky water, leaving behind a residue of previous meals and their associated bacteria. You grab a quick cup of diluted wine, or a bowl of gruel, and you're essentially trusting your life to the vendor's standards of cleanliness, which were almost certainly far below what you'd consider acceptable today. Historians still debate the precise health impact of Roman street food, but the constant presence of gastrointestinal parasites in Roman skeletal remains strongly suggests that food and water contamination was a pervasive issue for the urban poor. The environment of these eateries was itself a hazard. They were often cramped, smoky, and poorly ventilated. Sanitation was rudimentary, with waste likely discarded directly into the streets or into overflowing sewers. Rodents and insects would be omnipresent, drawn by the constant availability of food scraps. You might find yourself eating next to a pile of refuse, or sharing your meal with a persistent fly, simply accepting it as part of urban life. This exposure to a constant barrage of pathogens from both the food and the environment made every street food meal a potential health lottery. The lack of regulated food safety standards meant that vendors could easily cut corners, putting profit before health. There was no public health department to inspect kitchens or enforce cleanliness. You relied solely on the vendor's reputation, or your own good luck. This unregulated market, while providing cheap food, also ensured a high degree of risk for the consumer. It's a bit like playing Russian roulette with every bite, hoping today isn't the day you draw the unlucky number. Even simple drinks could be dangerous. While wine was often diluted with water to make it safer than pure water, vendors might use water from contaminated sources. And sometimes, unscrupulous vendors might even add questionable additives to their drinks to enhance flavor or appearance. Completely unaware of potential toxicity, you're simply looking for refreshment, but you might be getting a bonus dose of something you definitely didn't ask for. So, as you drift further into sleep, let the gritty, greasy, and somewhat unsettling image of ancient Roman street food settle in your mind. It was convenient, it was cheap, but it was also a daily gamble with your health, a constant exposure to invisible dangers lurking in every bite and sip. You feel the ghostly tang of stale stew and questionable ingredients, a reminder that even the quickest, simplest meal in ancient Rome could bring instant regret, or a lingering illness. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That getting a quick bite on the go was truly a hazardous adventure. You're still there, lingering in the slightly unsettling memory of ancient Roman street food, perhaps feeling a phantom grumble in your imaginary stomach. We've journeyed through the entire culinary landscape of ancient Rome, from the ubiquitous garum to the dodgy bread, the bland porridge, the tough vegetables, the rare meat, the lead-laced wine, the hazards of dining, and the questionable delights of street food. Now, as our culinary tour concludes, let's consider the long-term and systemic impact of this diet on the ancient Roman body diet's health or lack thereof. You feel the long-term impact on your ancient body. Imagine yourself as an ordinary Roman, living day in and day out on this particular diet. You might survive childhood, a significant feat in itself, given the high infant mortality rates, but your body would bear the subtle, cumulative marks of your daily sustenance. This isn't just about feeling full, it's about the chronic, often debilitating, effects of a diet that was both nutritionally adequate in some ways and shockingly deficient or even harmful in others. First, let's revisit that gritty bread. Remember the stone particles over years of chewing. Your teeth would suffer immense wear and tear. You'd likely experience constant dental pain, chipped teeth, and gum infections. Without modern dentistry, These infections could easily spread, leading to abscesses, bone loss, and in severe cases, even systemic infections that could be fatal. Imagine the persistent, dull ache in your mouth, a constant reminder of every meal you've ever eaten. Historians still debate the precise prevalence of various dental issues in ancient Rome, but archaeological findings of numerous skeletal remains show widespread evidence of severe tooth wear, cavities, and abscesses among the Roman population, regardless of social class. Then there's the lead. Remember the lead-sweetened wine, the lead pipes, the lead-lined cooking pots. For the wealthy, this chronic exposure would lead to a slow, insidious poisoning. You might experience chronic fatigue, digestive issues, joint pain, and gradually neurological problems like memory loss, irritability, and even madness. For women, lead poisoning could lead to increased rates of miscarriage and stillbirth, contributing to lower birth rates among the elite. You'd see these symptoms, perhaps attribute them to the curses of the gods or simply old age, never realizing the subtle chemical assault your daily comforts inflicted upon you. A little-known detail is that Roman doctors, like Galen, did record symptoms consistent with lead poisoning, but lacked the scientific understanding to attribute them to their true cause. They just saw it as a mysterious affliction. For the common person, while less exposed to lead in wine, other issues prevailed. The reliance on contaminated water sources and often unhygienic food preparation would lead to constant gastrointestinal distress. You might suffer from recurring bouts of dysentery, parasitic infections, remember those parasites found in Roman latrines, and chronic stomach upset. These conditions would weaken your body, making you more susceptible to other diseases and reducing your overall energy and productivity. Imagine a constant state of mild nausea or diarrhea, a background hum of digestive discomfort that was simply a part of your daily life. Nutritional deficiencies were also a concern. While their diet provided sufficient calories mostly from grains, it could be lacking in certain vitamins and minerals. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, while often associated with sailors, could affect landlocked populations if fresh fruits and vegetables were scarce or improperly stored. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, could impact bone development, especially in children living in crowded, sun-deprived urban environments. You might observe a general frailty, a susceptibility to illness that you simply attributed to fate. The low meat consumption for the poor meant a constant struggle for adequate protein and iron, leading to issues like anemia. You might feel perpetually tired, weak, and dizzy, unable to perform heavy labor as effectively. This was just your body adapting to a bare minimum existence. Finally, consider the cumulative psychological toll. Living with constant physical discomfort, dental pain, stomach issues, fatigue, compounded by the constant threat of deadly disease. Remember those plagues and the gnawing anxiety of food spoilage would have created a backdrop of pervasive misery. Your daily diet, meant to sustain life, also became a source of subtle, relentless suffering. You didn't just eat your food, you endured it, and its after effects. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That for all their triumphs, the Romans lived with daily, pervasive culinary discomfort and unseen health hazards. As you close your eyes, let the final, lingering image of ancient Roman food fade into the night. It wasn't the glorious, lavish feasts often depicted, but a harsh, often unappetizing reality for many, filled with grit, potential poisons, and perpetual discomfort. You feel the ghostly echoes of those aches and ailments, a testament to a life where even the most basic sustenance was a daily challenge.